You'd think setting someone on fire would be the most dramatic way to say goodbye, but Viking funerals often skipped the flames. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight we'll drift quietly through 1,000 years of Nordic rituals that rarely look the way you think. Not every Viking had a funeral fit for a saga. Some burials were loud pyres, crackling horns, sounding warriors roaring, but others were still. A body laid gently in the earth, stones carefully arranged, no fire, no ship, just silence. What determined the send-off? Was it status region or something stranger? If stories like this slow your thoughts better than melatonin and a rain app, go ahead and like and subscribe. I promise these tales smolder more than they blaze. And if you're listening from a windswept town or a foggy hilltop, let me know who's your favorite obscure figure from the Viking Age. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a pebbled shoreline somewhere in early medieval Scandinavia. It smells of wet stone and dried kelp. There's no great fire, no rhythmic chanting, just a quiet procession of mourners, their cloaks heavy with moisture, carrying a simple wooden body sled. They don't head for the sea. They move inland. This isn't the Viking funeral you expected. The body wrapped in furs is being taken to a burial mound, not a flaming longboat. There's no dramatic push into the waves, no fire-tipped arrow flying through the mist. Instead, a shallow grave is dug near a farmstead. The mourners place a few personal items, maybe a carved spoon, or the man's walking stick beside him. Then they cover him in soil. No songs. Just a pause. And then they walk away. This was a common farewell for those who didn't die in battle: farmers, merchants, children, elders. Contrary to Hollywood, most Viking funerals were quiet, earthy affairs. Archaeologists have found far more grave mounds than burned ships. Simple burials, sometimes topped with stones or wooden markers, dotted the landscape of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. In some regions, especially further inland or during harsh winters, fire was impractical or even forbidden. Trees were too valuable for building homes or heating hearths, so bodies were laid in the earth or in stone-lined chambers beneath mounds. These mounds still rise like knuckles in the fields, some surrounded by grazing sheep. One particularly curious variant, sky burials. Yes, there's some evidence, albeit debated, that in remote northern areas, bodies were exposed to the elements intentionally. Not unlike Tibetan sky burials, these involved leaving the dead on raised platforms or cliffs to be consumed by birds. Was it a form of spiritual release or simple pragmatism when the ground was too frozen to dig? Some scholars argue sky burials were rare, perhaps more myth than fact. Others point to fragmentary Norse texts that mention bones being picked clean by the wind. There's no scholarly consensus, but the imagery lingers. Whatever the method, the key element in Viking death wasn't fire, it was return. Returning the body to earth, to sea, or to sky. Not always with fanfare, often just with respect. The silence of the burial doesn't last long. As you follow the retreating mourners, your path takes you to a different kind of sight. One with no body, no mound, and no grave. Just stones. Dozens of them arranged in precise, deliberate formations. Not haphazard, never that. Every rock is placed with intent. They look like ships carved into the land itself. Some form perfect ovals, their tips pointed like prows. Others stretch in sweeping arcs like the curve of a hull. You walk the perimeter of one and count the stones, 16 each one, worn but upright the size of a barrel. Someone placed these here long ago, and whatever they meant it seriously. In Viking culture, these stone circles were often the first act in saying farewell. Before a funeral, before a body was even prepared, family members or community elders would lay out these outlines. They marked a sacred space, a boundary, or a passageway. No one agrees exactly. Some historians argue these ship-like stone circles symbolized a vessel to carry the soul to the afterlife. Not a literal ship, but a spiritual one. A memory of the sea, even in places where no water touched the land. Others believe the stones mirrored constellations guiding the spirit as the stars guided sailors. There's even a theory quietly debated at academic conferences that these arrangements weren't for the dead at all, but for the living, markers of territory lineage or seasonal rituals, that funerals simply repurposed old ceremonial spaces. After all, Vikings were famously pragmatic. Why build new when the old would do? At Anunshög in Sweden, one of the largest stone ship circles stretches nearly 100 feet long. Archaeologists have debated for over a century whether it marks a king's burial or a tribal assembly site. The bones beneath it are fragmentary, scattered, some charred, some not, which only deepens the mystery. You crouch beside one of the stones and run your fingers over its mossy surface. It's cold, heavy, and older than the Viking Age itself, possibly Bronze Age. Could it be that the Vikings inherited these sites from an even earlier people? There's no consensus, but the dates don't always match the stories. One detail often overlooked: some of these stone circles had central hearths or pits long since filled in. Were they used for cremations or feasting offerings? The ashes tell different stories depending on who reads them. You step back and take in the whole formation again. It doesn't scream of war or conquest. It whispers of structure, of cosmology, of people who saw death not as an end, but as a moment needing orientation, north-south, sun-sea-soul. And maybe those left behind needed the shape of something familiar. A ship, a circle, a symbol of movement towards something else. As the wind picks up the stones, hold still. Silent sentinels in the grass, they remain anchored in mystery. Now your path veers inland far from the surf and salt of the fjords, to a field of grass that hides an unexpected surprise, a ship buried not in water, but in soil. At first glance it seems absurd, a boat on dry land sealed under a mound. But as you approach the ground, slopes gently over the hull's curved remains, and you begin to understand the symbolism at play. This is a burial ship, or, depending on whom you ask, a ship-shaped illusion. Some Viking graves did include actual wooden ships hauled to the burial site at great expense. These weren't everyday fishing vessels. They were elaborate, often carved and sized for both status and spectacle. But more commonly, the Vikings created the impression of a ship lines of stones, timber frames, or even painted outlines that mimicked the vessel's shape. The idea wasn't always to send someone off to sea, it was to make sure their soul had a vehicle. The sea was central to Viking life, so it became central to their death. Even if the grave lay miles from the nearest shore, the ship motif anchored the body in a language of passage. You walk beside one such grave now, its stone outline faint but traceable beneath the grass. 12 stones mark the bow and stern, and smaller rocks arc around the sides. Within the space, faint depressions suggest something once lay here, perhaps grave goods, perhaps a body long since turned to soil. Some archaeologists believe these symbolic burials were born of necessity. Wood was scarce. Not everyone could afford a real boat. So they built imitations, hollow frames, symbolic keels, stone shadows of real ships. Others suggest these choices were deliberate, not budgetary, that the symbolism mattered more than the material. In the Norwegian countryside, the Tunship burial revealed an actual boat interred with its owner, but curiously the body was missing. Did looters get there first? Or was the ship the real message and the occupant an afterthought? Researchers continue to debate. Then there's the Gokstad ship, one of the most famous finds. Exhumed from a burial mound, it held weapons, game boards, sledges, and remnants of once fine textiles. The man buried there had high status, but again, the emphasis was on the ship, not the man. Its craftsmanship dominated the scene. One quirky detail. Some of these ships, real or fake, included animal bones scattered near the bull, horses, dogs, even peacocks in rare cases. Were these companions offerings or status symbols? Theories abound. There is no scholarly consensus on why these specific creatures were chosen, but their presence adds an air of otherworldly travel. You imagine now what it must have been like to attend one of these funerals, no sails, no water, but a ship, nonetheless rooted in earth, pointing toward the horizon. As if the Vikings believed that the journey didn't need real waves, only the idea of them. The next grave you come across is cluttered, not chaotic, just full. You peer inside the low mound, half uncovered by archaeologists and rain, and see the unexpected: a hand axe beside a butter churn, a rusted sword wedged between a skillet and a ladle, and at the foot of the skeleton, a bundle of keys. It's like someone packed for every possible afterlife scenario: battle breakfast or bookkeeping. Viking burials, it turns out, weren't one size fits all. And grave goods weren't just symbolic trophies of conquest. They were practical sometimes, oddly domestic. The dead were buried with what they'd need for the next world, or what the living hoped they'd need. Weapons, certainly, but also spinning tools, baking stones, fish hooks, and combs. One woman's grave in Burka included a loom weight and shears. Another had a milk strainer. These weren't ornaments. They were the artifacts of ordinary life, elevated to eternal importance. You lean over the lip of the grave and notice an apple shriveled but unmistakable. Fruit wasn't common in burial sites, but it did appear. Was it a snack for the journey? A token of sweetness? Some scholars think it symbolized fertility or rebirth. Others believe it was seasonal, a fresh apple added at the time of death, simply because it was available. The presence of axes and apples side by side makes the whole grave feel like a travel kit. The dead might need to defend themselves, or fix a door, or bake something, or brew. You never know in the afterlife. Interestingly, the division of labor persists even in death. Men's graves often emphasize weapons and tools. Women's graves lean toward keys, jewelry, and household implements. But the boundaries blur. Some graves contain both. Some warriors were buried with cooking pots. Some women with blades. Was it identity or status? Historians still debate. In fact, the key is a recurring motif. Women of high standing were often buried with keys hung from brooches or belts. This wasn't just a symbol, it was literal. Keys to chests, storerooms, and households. In life, and apparently in death, they managed the domain. You picture a scene now, a family gathered around the body of a loved one, selecting items for burial, not out of ritual, but memory. She always used this kettle. He never left without that knife. It's touching in a quiet, practical way. One overlooked detail. Many graves include fire starting kits, flint steel tinder. Were these tools for the next world? Or just a final courtesy from the living, in case the spirit needed to light its own way? As you move away from the grave, the clutter feels less odd. It feels familiar, like a person's nightstand or junk drawer, lovingly packed into eternity. Vikings didn't just bury warriors. They buried people messy, skilled, hungry, and deeply remembered. And judging by the assortment left behind, they were preparing for more than just Valhalla. They were packing for life. The trail grows quieter now, as if the land itself is holding its breath. Ahead, in a clearing marked by dark stones and bent grass, lies a burial that feels more sacred than the rest. You approach carefully, not because of fear, but out of reverence. Here beside the body are horses. 2 of them. Perfectly arranged legs folded beneath heads angled as if resting. But they're not asleep. They were sacrificed. Horse burials were rare and reserved for the elite. Not every Viking got a steed in the afterlife. Those who did, they were considered important chieftains, warriors, nobles, and sometimes women of high standing. These animals weren't just status symbols. They were spiritual escorts ferrying the soul to wherever Viking spirits rode next. The bodies of the horses are puzzling. Some lie with elegant stillness, as if they pass gently. Others show signs of hurried dispatch. Was it violence ceremony? Some scholars believe the horses were given soporific herbs to ease them into death. Others think the act was swift and symbolic. There is no agreement, just bones and lingering questions. In a burial site at Ladby, Denmark, an entire ship burial included a man laid beside his horse along with riding gear, and even a harness decorated with silver. But the strangest find: the horse's teeth had been polished, carefully, lovingly. Was this vanity or ritual grooming to prepare the animal for a journey beyond? You bend to examine the space between the horse and the human. Scattered here are bits of tack, bridle stirrups, fragments of leather. Sometimes the reins were knotted. Other times they were deliberately cut. Symbolism. Perhaps the final ride had ended. Or perhaps the Vikings believed in unbinding the animal's spirit. And not all burials paired horses with men. Some graves with female skeletons also include horses. One grave in Iceland revealed a woman buried with a mare, a sword, and a gaming board. A priestess, a leader, a horsewoman of myth. Researchers continue to debate her role, but she certainly wasn't buried like a housewife. One particularly overlooked find horse skulls buried beneath thresholds or doors. These weren't attached to human graves at all, but rather tucked under the entrances to longhouses. Some believe they served as protection's spiritual guardians. Others argue they symbolize the sacrifice required to build or bless a home. There's something unsettling and beautiful about it. These creatures prized in life became companions in death. Did the Vikings believe their bond endured beyond breath? Or did the horses themselves become part of the ritual, a necessary cost of transcendence? You step back, imagining the final moment, a warrior or matriarch laid down for the last time, and the horse, once swift and strong, offered in silence. No battle cries, just the soft thud of hooves against earth, the final exhale, and then stillness. Somewhere, a raven calls overhead. The breeze lifts the grass around the burial, and the memory of the hoofbeat lingers echoing into the afterlife. As the burial field thins into coastal scrubland, the wind sharpens. Salt and ash mingle in the air. You follow the scent to a clearing where charred wood, blackened rocks, and patches of melted sand suggest something powerful happened here. A pyre. A Viking cremation, though likely not the tidy kind legends suggest. The wind, as you quickly learn, is no friend to fire. Viking cremations were messy, unpredictable affairs. Bodies rarely burned completely. Bones scattered in the grass, half-charred logs, collapsed and smoke poured sideways instead of upward. Some pyres flared too fast. Others fizzled. And through it all, the coastal winds refused to cooperate. You crouch beside the charred earth and imagine the ritual, a platform of logs stacked carefully, the body laid on top, surrounded by offerings, perhaps weapons, cloaks, bowls of food, even animals. Then the fire is lit and everything becomes uncertain. It's easy to romanticize the image of a longboat aflame, slipping into the sea with grace and glory. But historical records suggest this was the exception, not the rule. Most Viking cremations happened on land, often close to settlements or near important grave mounds. Water-based burnings were rare, partly because boats were too valuable to sacrifice regularly, and partly because fire and water aren't the best of friends. One fascinating twist: bones from multiple cremations were sometimes gathered, sorted, and buried together, like communal ash graves. Did this reflect kinship, shared fate, or resourcefulness? Archaeologists disagree. Some believe these collective burials were pragmatic. Others see them as deeply spiritual gestures. Then there's the smoke itself. At certain sites, traces of floral oils and herbs have been detected in the residue. Was this ritual purification, an attempt to mask the smell of burning flesh, or simply a custom lost to time? Scholars remain divided. In the cold coastal regions, full cremation often failed. Winters were too damp, wood too scarce, and fires hard to control. In some cases, only partial cremation occurred, leaving bones, charred flesh, and relics fused in lumps of slag. This wasn't a clean farewell. It was raw, elemental, and deeply human. One quirky archaeological discovery in some cremation sites, melted fragments of glass beads were found fused to bone. This suggests the deceased were cremated in full-dress jewelry belts, even shoes. Was it formality, vanity, or simply the belief that one should face the afterlife as one lived fully adorned? You look down at a soot-stained stone ring marking the edge of a former pyre. The grass is growing back, but the heat still seems to shimmer. A small bird hops across the ashes unbothered. Time has softened the sharpness, but not erased the ritual. In this place, the wind continues its old resistance, a reminder that fire doesn't always obey. And in Viking funerals, the result was never perfect. But perhaps that was the point, to wrestle the elements just once more before letting go. Beyond the smoke-swept fields and wind-warped pyres, you find something far more refined. A mound larger than most, rising gently near a forest edge, its silhouette unmistakably shaped like a ship. You pause. This isn't just any burial. This is the Oseberg Queen's resting place. Or so we think. The Oseberg ship, unearthed in Norway in 1904, is one of the most magnificent Viking burials ever discovered. The ship itself is a masterpiece, intricately carved prow-wide deck, and over 70 feet of timber elegance. Inside lay two women, one older, one younger, wrapped in silk and wool, surrounded by splendor. But their identities, still a mystery. One wore robes dyed in precious madder, read the other a tunic of pale blue. Were they queens, priestesses, a mother and daughter? The older woman had worn boots and had a comb tucked beneath her. Not exactly royal regalia, but dignified. The younger woman's bones bore signs of illness. Some believe she was sacrificed. Others think she died naturally and was buried in honor. The theories conflict and multiply. You walk slowly along the reconstructed footprint, trying to imagine the ship in its full glory. Draped tapestries once hung from poles. A carved cart painted and delicate stood nearby. Animal remains, dogs, oxen, possibly even peacocks, were placed around the women. These weren't just status markers. They were statements, invitations to the next world. One curious detail among the grave goods was a bucket made of imported yew wood. Not grand, but personal. Was it used for washing, brewing? Its inclusion feels deliberate, a reminder that even amid grandeur, small comforts mattered. Then there's the bedposts, 4 of them ornately carved, resting where the women had lain. The carvings depict intertwined animals and mythic beasts. Were these simply decorative, or did they tell a story, one we no longer know how to read? Scholars still argue whether the imagery had ritual meaning or was just elite craftsmanship. Perhaps the most debated element is the burial's timing. The ship was buried in 834 AD, but some of the objects inside are older. Were they heirlooms, spoils? Or had the ship been prepared long before death? The grave feels rehearsed, curated, like a museum of memory. As you trace the path around the ship's outline, you notice small iron nails scattered in the soil remnants of its construction. And you can't help but wonder how many hands built this vessel, knowing it would never sail. It was a ship for eternity, not for water. The Oseberg burial isn't loud. It doesn't scream of conquest or violence. It hums, with elegance, with mystery, with unspoken grief. It whispers of a world where death wasn't just an end, it was a final display rich in symbols we may never fully decode. And standing here now, you feel it too. The weight of that display and the silence that followed when the last spade of earth fell. The land grows colder as you press northward. Pines thin into spindly shadows, and the wind sharpens against your cheeks. Ahead lies a cliff not grand but exposed. Jagged stones overlook a frozen valley. It's here in this place of solitude and ice that a very different kind of burial took place. There is no grave, no mound, no pyre. Just the sky and what remains of a wooden platform lashed together with weathered rope. This was not a funeral with fire. This was a sky burial. The concept seems foreign, unsettling even. To leave a body exposed, unprotected from the elements and animals. But to some Viking communities, especially those in remote or extreme regions, this was not neglect. It was ceremony, a gesture of return, not abandonment. Birds, especially ravens and eagles, held symbolic power in Norse belief. Odin himself had two ravens, Hugin and Munin, who flew across the world gathering knowledge. To be consumed by such creatures was not horror, it was transcendence. The body offered to the sky became part of the world, again taken by sacred messengers. You crouch where the platform once stood, noticing the arrangement of stones that anchored its posts. It wasn't haphazard, someone built this intentionally, and though time has stripped it bare, the idea lingers in the air like a breath held too long. Some historians argue these sky burials were born of necessity. In frozen seasons when the ground was too hard to dig and firewood too precious to burn, exposure was the only option. Others believe the practice was sacred from the start, its practicality simply aligning with belief. The debate continues with little consensus. One overlooked detailed traces of herbs and lichen found on the platforms. Were these for preservation repellents or offerings in themselves? No one knows, but the act suggests care not indifference. And the bodies, well, they rarely survive. Scavengers scatter bones. Wind takes what it will. What remains are hints, tooth fragments, beads, sometimes a rusted brooch wedged in a crevice. Enough to confirm the practice, but never enough to satisfy the curious. You imagine now the last hours of such a burial. The body wrapped in wool placed gently on the platform, hands folded, eyes perhaps covered. The family would say their farewells, then walk away. There was no closing of a lid, no earth to pat down, just space and waiting. Was it terrifying to leave a loved one like that? Or comforting to know they'd join the sky piece by piece? In some Icelandic sagas, the dead speak through birds. In others, they become them. The imagery blurs. You stand now chilled and gaze out across the cliffs. A raven wheels overhead. The wind pulls at your sleeves. And for a moment, you understand. This wasn't abandonment. It was exposure as reverence. Letting the body speak to the elements and the elements answer. No fire, no grave. Just sky and whatever waited beyond it. As you step away from the cliffs and back toward the settlements, you notice a small burial chamber partially unearthed. The skeleton within is intact mostly. But something's missing the coins. This is the grave you heard, whispered about, the one rumored to hold a Viking with coins on the eyes. Except it doesn't. You crouch closer. No gleam of metal, no imprints in the soil, just sockets still and empty. The tradition of placing coins on the eyes of the dead is widespread Greek-Roman, even some early Christian burials. The idea is simple and symbolic payment for the ferryman Karin to guide the soul across the river to the afterlife. But did the Vikings do this? That's where things get murky. Some graves in Scandinavia do contain coins, but not always on the face. Often they're found in pouches under the back or clutched in hand. sometimes foreign Arabic silver dirhams, Byzantine pieces, Anglo-Saxon pennies. Were these tokens of trade or tributes for the afterlife? The placement is inconsistent, and archaeologists continue to argue whether the Norse adopted this funerary custom or simply handled a lot of loose change. You brush aside some dirt near the skull and notice a faint green stain, possibly from a corroded copper coin. Maybe it was there once, maybe not. The absence is just as intriguing as the presence. Interestingly, some Viking graves contain no coins at all, but still show signs of ritual knives tucked beneath ribs, beads draped over brows, feathers laid beneath feet. Did these objects serve the same purpose? Were they symbolic tolls meant to ease the spirit's passage? Some scholars believe the Vikings merged their own beliefs with those they encountered, borrowing and bending practices to suit their cosmology. A quirky detail. In a few cases, coins have been found drilled with holes and strung as jewelry, not for payment, but as fashion. One woman in Hedeby wore 6 foreign coins as part of her necklace. Was this wealth ritual or simply style? There's no scholarly consensus. Back in this grave, though, it's the silence that speaks. The face tells no story of coins. But that doesn't mean they weren't part of the narrative. Oral traditions mention silver sent with the soul. But where that silver ended up is anyone's guess. You step back and look again at the burial in its simplicity bones. A rusted knife, a bead near the collarbone. The myth of the coin eyes might be just that, a myth. Or it might be true in fragments practiced inconsistently reserved for the wealthy or adopted from southern neighbors. What's clear is that the Vikings didn't deal in absolutes. Their funerals varied, adapted, improvised. One person's grave could echo Roman customs. Another's might reject them entirely. As you leave the site, a flash of light catches your eye, just a sliver of metal half buried in the dirt. You dig gently, brush away the soil, and hold up a coin. No eyes beneath it, but still a kind of story. You don't expect to be surprised anymore. After all, you've seen warriors with looms and queens with carts. But then you stumble across a grave that once fooled everyone. A skeleton buried with weapon shield fragments and a set of arrows. For decades, it was classified without question as male, until DNA told a different story. The warrior was a woman. This grave, discovered in Birka, Sweden, rocked the archaeological world. The skeleton had been laid out with a sword at the hip, spears at the side, and 2 horses nearby, classic markers of a high-status warrior. For over a century, scholars pointed to it as a prime example of a Viking fighter's final resting place, until researchers re-examined the bones in the 2010s and ran genetic tests. Female, no ambiguity, and suddenly every assumption had to be reconsidered. You kneel at the edge of the reconstruction, picturing the woman in life. Did she ride into battle? Was she a military leader? Or was the burial symbolic, loaded with meaning, rather than autobiography? Some scholars argue she was a commander, pointing to the game board buried beside her, possibly used for strategy. Others caution against modern projections, suggesting the grave might represent ritual status, or a different form of authority altogether. One thing is certain, she was not buried like a servant or a wife. Her grave mirrors those of elite male warriors, which suggests at the very least that she held extraordinary importance in her community. There's a quirky twist to this story. When the skeleton was first excavated in the 1880s, the lead archaeologist drew a mustache on the reconstruction sketch just to complete the image. That sketch was referenced for decades. It wasn't until bones, not sketches, were examined that the truth came through. A quiet reminder of how often our assumptions shape the stories we tell. Other graves of weapon-buried women have since been found. Not as grand, perhaps, but notable. Swords with narrow pelvises, daggers paired with brooches. In some cases, women appear to have held dual roles, both spiritual and martial. Were they shield maidens, priestesses? Something in between. The sagas, as always, muddy the waters. They speak of women like Lagertha and Brynhild, fierce, noble, tragic. But they also blur fact and fiction, wrapping real possibilities in myth. Some historians argue that female warriors were rare exceptions. Others think we've simply failed to recognize them due to centuries of biased classification. You walk slowly around the edge of the grave, imagining the day she was laid to rest. Was there mourning celebration? Did people whisper her name with awe or fear? Whatever her story, her burial remains one of the most debated finds in Viking archaeology. The weapons remain where they were placed, silent, sharp, and no longer belonging to the kind of warrior history once expected. And now, when you hear someone speak of Viking men, you'll remember this quiet grave, the bones that broke a century's worth of narrative, and the woman warrior who even in death rewrote the story. You're back near the coast now, walking along a narrow fjord lined with wildflowers and lichen-covered rocks. At first it seems peaceful, but the breeze carries something strange. A smell not unpleasant, just layered, salt smoke, and something floral, faint as memory. It's a funeral scent lingering long after the flames have gone cold. This inlet, archaeologists say, was once a ritual site, a place where Viking farewells unfolded regularly. The soil here is blackened with ash, flecked with bone fragments. But the real surprise came not from the charcoal, but from pollen. In multiple layers of the burial ground, researchers discovered traces of meadowsweet wild chamomile and yarrow plants, known for their scent, color, and use in early medicine. Had the Vikings laid flowers on the dead? Were blooms part of the ceremony, or did these plants simply grow wild, caught up in the grave by chance? There's no scholarly agreement. Some suggest flowers were added to mask the odor of decomposition. Others think they served symbolic roles, purity transition, or remembrance. A few posit they were gifts to the gods, part of a sensory offering, alongside food and drink. One theory, still fringe but oddly charming, suggests that certain plants were meant to guide the spirit through the underworld by their fragrance. You crouch by the edge of the fjord, picking a bit of yarrow between your fingers. The smell is sharp, earthy. Easy to imagine it crushed in a handful and scattered over a body. Was this done in silence or to the rhythm of chanting horns, a final toast? One grave near this site held not just bones, but a shallow dish, burnt around the rim, possibly once filled with oil or herbs. It was laid at the feet of the dead, surrounded by what might have been flower petals. The dish's purpose is unknown. Was it for light scent? Farewell. A quirky find from another burial across the fjord, a single stalk of wheat, perfectly preserved beside the pelvis of the deceased. No one knows why. A symbol of the harvest. A final snack, or simply something that clung to a robe as the body was lowered, and then there's the ash. In some areas it formed layers so fine and consistent that they resemble volcanic dust. Mixed in were traces of animal fat, and oddly pollen again, as if the flowers weren't scattered once but repeatedly. Perhaps each mourner brought a bloom. Perhaps flowers were burned with the body, their scent rising in the smoke. There is no firm conclusion. Some scholars still argue the flowers arrived by accident, blown in by wind, or dropped by grazing animals. But the regularity, the persistence of pollen across multiple graves suggests otherwise. Something intentional, tender, and fragrant once marked these farewells. You rise from the earth and follow the breeze again. The scent lingers on your hands, a whisper of a rite that never made it into the sagas, but remains faint and floral in the soil. The hills rise gently now, guiding you to another strange and solemn sight, a ship proudly built, but going nowhere. Its keel rests not in water, but on a bed of turf. No waves will ever touch its hull, No oars will ever dip. This is a burial ship crafted solely to carry the dead across imagined seas. You circle it slowly. The workmanship is exquisite planks fitted with care ribs curved to perfection. Yet, there's no sail, no supplies. It was never meant to move. Some Viking funerals involved real ships being burned or buried. But others like this one use vessels constructed for one purpose, only to hold the body. Not for battle, not for fishing, for spectacle, for symbolism, for the slow theater of grief. You climb closer and see the central cavity where a coffin once lay. Around it, traces of wood ash and iron nails. Grave goods too, a broken spear, a leather belt, a wooden bowl now cracked with age. These weren't staged like a hero's treasure hoard, they were placed with domestic familiarity, like setting a nightstand beside the dead. Historians remain divided on the meaning. Was this kind of ship a spiritual chariot built to show the soul's journey? Or was it a display of wealth and power? After all, few communities could afford the time and timber to build a boat that would never float. Some scholars argue these burials were political theater reminders of lineage legacy and control over both sea and land. The Gokstad and Oseberg ships may have been seaworthy once, but others like the Thun ship or Myklebostad burials seem to have been constructed strictly for death. No sailcloth, no rudder. Just a hull, a body, and a carefully chosen location. One overlooked aspect, these ships were often placed in prominent places, hillsides, coastal bluffs, visible from afar. It wasn't about concealment, it was about visibility. The dead didn't sail away, they stayed looming silent, anchored in memory. There's even evidence that some of these ships were left open for a time, not buried immediately, as if the community needed to see the body, the ship, and the ritual before the earth claimed it all. One burial site showed signs of weathering on the interior of the hull, suggesting days or even weeks exposed to sun and rain. And then the burial would be completed. Earth piled over the vessel until only the outline remained. The ship that never sailed became a hill, a monument, a story frozen in wood and soil. You step back and take in the full scene. From a distance, the shape still holds like a wave rising in the ground, frozen mid-crest. This wasn't a practical vessel. It was a metaphor made real, a ship that didn't go to sea because it didn't have to. The journey was inward, or upward, or simply symbolic, and so it sits forever in port, yet never truly still. The grandeur fades as you leave the coastal heights and follow a narrow trail between farm plots humble and uneven. The air changes to warmer familiar. You pass stone thresholds, low fences, and small gardens. And here among cabbage patches and sheep pens is where some Vikings laid their dead. No ships, no mounds, just ashes beneath the family farm. Not every Viking burial was grand. For many, especially those of modest means, cremation meant a simple fire. The ashes once cooled and gathered were not taken to temples or stacked with treasure. They were brought home, scattered into fields, poured beneath doorways, pressed into the land itself. One such burial was discovered beneath the threshold of a longhouse in rural Norway. Human ash mingled with soil and bone, layered directly beneath the entry step. No grave goods, no marker, just presence, quiet and practical. The dead watching over the comings and goings of daily life. Was this reverence utility or simply proximity? Scholars remain divided. Some argue this practice reflected intimacy, that keeping the dead close was an act of love. Others believe it was efficiency, why travel far when the home is already sacred. A curious find in Iceland revealed traces of bone ash scattered through a sheep field. Not buried, not sealed, just mixed into the dirt. Some think it was meant to enrich the land, a final act of giving back. Others suggest a form of ancestral connection, linking the spirit of the deceased to the livelihood of the living. And this wasn't just for peasants. Even high-status individuals had ashes placed in domestic settings. One chieftain's cremains were stored in a ceramic pot and placed in a hearth, then later walled into the foundation of a new home. His body became part of the architecture, both literally and symbolically. You pause at a small stone ring set in the garden earth. It might be a well, it might be a marker, but local stories suggest it once held the ashes of a grandmother who never missed a sunrise. Whether true or legend, it carries weight. One quirky detail: some families stored ashes in carved wooden boxes or even hollowed out logs, placing them in the rafters or behind wall panels, hidden but nearby. Was this a form of ongoing dialogue with the dead, or just the Viking version of a family urn? There is no singular explanation. These ash-scattering practices varied across regions, eras, and social groups. Some were ritualized, others likely improvised. But they all suggest the same truth: not every Viking death led to spectacle. Many ended with a return to soil, hearth, and habit. You step across one such threshold, now real or imagined. The house ahead may be long gone, but the presence remains. You feel it in the warmth of the stones, the way the wind softens around the corners. Not all goodbyes need banners and boats. Some just need a place to stay. Evening settles as you approach a flattened mound at the edge of a glade. It's quiet, but not in the way of solitude. The silence here feels charged, as if something unseen has only just stopped moving. Then you notice the flat stones arranged in a crude ring like a makeshift stage. This was once the ground of a dance, but not the joyful kind. Some Viking funerals, according to scattered medieval texts and sagas, included dances. Not graceful reels or festive steps, but jerky, repetitive motions. Movements that seemed more ritual than rhythm. Arms flailed, feet stamped in loops, hips swayed off-beat, and always the dancers wore strange expressions, masks even, grins, grimaces, blank stares. Why? The sources are unclear. Christian scribes described these dances with a mixture of mockery and fear. To them, it was pagan nonsense, ungodly gyrations around the dead. But deeper reading suggests something else aright: a farewell, a performance to ward off spirits, or invite them. You imagine it now: dust settling in a funeral pyre low in the background, and figures, relatives perhaps, moving in unison. Not elegant, intentional, like they were stepping through grief itself, or trying to shake something off before it clung to them. Some scholars believe these spirit dances were meant to confuse malevolent forces. If death had come to take a soul, perhaps it could be tricked, distracted by a body in motion, or by a living person pretending to be one of the dead. Others argue it was catharsis, releasing sorrow, not through wailing, but through movement. In one 13th century account, mourners at a chieftain's funeral danced with their cloaks held over their heads, spinning until they collapsed. The chronicler calls it absurd, but the pattern suggests a ritual: collapse as surrender, repetition as prayer. A quirky archaeological note: at some sites, footprints have been preserved in trampled clay floors, circling the funeral spot in odd overlapping arcs. No clear start or end. Just orbit after orbit, like planets caught in mourning. Some dances may have imitated animals, wolves, birds, even horses believed to guide or guard the soul. In one saga, a man performs a crow's dance at his sister's funeral, hopping and cawing until his voice breaks. Was it grief madness or something sacred? There is no consensus. The Christian scribes may have exaggerated or misunderstood, or perhaps captured a truth the Vikings themselves never wrote down. You step into the ring of stones and try to picture the motions, not as mockery, but as farewell, the kind of ritual born not from logic, but from longing, a final gift of energy offered with arms flung wide as if to say, "Take this, take me too." but let them go. The air here still hums, not with music, but with memory. You feel it in your knees, in your breath, in the space between movement and stillness. Even the quietest goodbyes sometimes needed a rhythm. Just when you think you've reached the final resting place of Viking customs, the ground opens again figuratively, if not literally. You come upon a site long thought settled a burial mound, half-collapsed bones, removed, rearranged. Not by looters, not by modern archaeologists, by the Vikings themselves. Some graves weren't final. Scattered across Scandinavia are burial sites that show signs of revisiting, not by accident. Bones were pulled from their resting places, sometimes carefully stacked elsewhere, sometimes missing entirely. Tools that had once accompanied the dead were taken. Skulls placed on posts, limbs shifted or removed altogether. You kneel beside one such disturbed grave. The earth tells a confusing story. A femur that doesn't match the pelvis, a jawbone resting in the wrong corner, and in the center, a strange emptiness, as if something once sat there and was taken away. What was happening here? One theory points to ancestor veneration. The living may have returned to the graves of honored elders, removing bones for ritual purposes, ceremonies, blessings, maybe even protection. In some communities, these bones became household relics kept near hearths or under floors. Not trophies, but links to memory. But there's a darker interpretation. Some scholars believe these acts were defensive, that bones were dug up not to honor, but to neutralize. In Norse folklore, the dead didn't always stay dead. Revenants' restless corpses were feared. They could rise, bring disease, haunt dreams. So, perhaps these graves were disturbed to stop something, a bone removed to break the spell, a skull turned to face down so it wouldn't look back. You glance toward the tree line. One saga speaks of a burial mound dug into at night by a terrified farmer who feared his brother had returned, bringing nightmares with him. He found the corpse bloated and biting its own beard. The next day he burned it. Another curious find, certain reburials include iron scissors or pins driven into the chest cavity of a skeleton. Was this a symbolic pinning down insurance against rising? No one knows. But the pattern appears often enough to spark debate. Even the timing matters. Some graves show signs of disturbance months or even years after burial. This wasn't immediate. It was considered, remembered, possibly feared, or revered. You shift your footing and feel a rock give way beneath the soil. It reveals a second chamber beneath the first. Another body older, smaller, placed in a fetal position. Had it been reburied beneath the first as an offering? A punishment. An act of succession. Theories stack like bones. Not all Viking dead were left alone. Some were moved, disturbed, perhaps visited like elders at a shrine, or unburied like monsters in a tale. You rise slowly, the weight of these rituals pressing gently on your thoughts. Viking funerals weren't a single tradition. They were a shifting landscape, fierce and tender, chaotic and careful. Even in death they weren't finished. Perhaps that's why, even among the living, silence carried weight. Rituals didn't always require movement. Sometimes it was sound that stirred things best, left still. You duck inside the longhouse just as the wind picks up. Your boots stamp off snow, and the warm, smoky air of the hearth welcomes you like an old friend. But as soon as you open your mouth to whistle a familiar tune, maybe a folk melody from your childhood, 3 older villagers look up sharply. One of them even spits into the fire. Whistling indoors, you're told, calls the wind. It's not poetic metaphor. It's a warning of sea storms stirred by foolish tongues of spirits who ride the breeze and slip inside with the smoke. Viking sailors and settlers carried this belief across the coastlines of Scandinavia, and it lingered long after the longship stopped launching. The idea had staying power. In fishing villages from Norway to the Orkney Islands, whistling under a roof was taboo well into the modern era. Elderly fishermen taught it to their children, and some reportedly still mutter rebukes if a tune escapes in a closed room. The origins of this belief are murky. Some scholars argue it stems from the seafaring culture of the Vikings, where a sudden storm could capsize a boat, and any unnatural sound might be blamed for provoking the gods of wind and wave. Others suspect it has shamanic roots in Norse magic. Sound held ritual power, and certain notes or chants were believed to summon or repel the unseen. A simple whistle then might accidentally mimic a call to something best left undisturbed. Whatever its roots, the superstition shaped behavior. Viking sailors reportedly stayed silent below decks, especially during rough seas. And in farming settlements, the rule extended to barns and storage huts. Any enclosed space was a portal, and sound could open it. There's one quirky twist that stands out in some regions. People made exceptions for birdsong. If a small bird chirped indoors, perhaps caught in a rafter or carried in a basket, it was considered a good omen, even sacred. Human whistling, however, was too deliberate, too clever. It showed intent, and that was dangerous. Today we whistle without fear, using it to hail taxis or annoy siblings. But in that longhouse centuries ago, your innocent melody would have been more than a faux pas. It might have been the beginning of something, a storm brewing at sea, a sudden illness, or just an old woman shaking her head and muttering that you'd brought the Draugr down upon them all. And so, in this quiet world of smoke and shadows, you press your lips together and say nothing, a faint creak under your boots, just the threshold settling until someone hisses at you to stop. You look down and notice your foot has disturbed something, a small rusty sliver of iron buried under the doorway stone. The elder nearby frowns, nudges it back into place with a boot heel, and mutters a charm under his breath. In Viking homes, that scrap of metal wasn't trash. It was protection. Step into any Viking dwelling, and there's a good chance you'd find iron tucked somewhere near the entrance. Not hammered into the wall or fashioned into a lock, but concealed hidden beneath a threshold stone behind a doorpost, sometimes even wound in the thatching. To the modern eye, it might look accidental, like a forgotten nail or an old tool fragment. But in the Viking imagination, iron had its own quiet power. Specifically, it was believed to ward off spirits, trolls, and other creeping things that slipped into homes at dusk. The logic was simple. Most creatures of the other world disliked iron. It hummed with a different energy, metallic heavy, forged in fire. And while Vikings had no chemistry labs or elemental charts, they understood iron's uncanny weight, its ability to bite into bone, and the way it seemed to hold a charge after cooling from the forge. In this world, the placement of iron wasn't random. The threshold was symbolic, a border between safety and the wild. Anything passing into the home had to cross it. So you buried a bit of iron there, like a warning or a snarl held in stone. People might never speak of it directly, but they didn't step over that metal lightly. Some scholars argue this ritual dates back to pre-Viking animist beliefs, where spirits were seen as tangible presences moving through physical space. Others suggest it came from Norse cosmology itself. The 9 realms of Yggdrasil were layered and porous, and humans needed boundaries to keep the unseen at bay. Then there are those who say it was just folk logic. Iron was expensive, valued, and symbolic of strength. So placing it at your door made a kind of sense. What's stranger is how long the tradition lingered. Even in 18th century Scandinavia, rural families sometimes slipped iron keys or fragments under new door frames. In some cases, churches in Iceland were built with nails placed intentionally in the entrance stone, not for structure but for spiritual insulation. The Viking word for threshold, threskolder, literally meant the place where threshing or separating happens. It wasn't just the grain that needed dividing from the chaff, but the living from the lurking. There's one story from Western Norway where a house was said to be cursed until someone remembered to bury an old horseshoe beneath the main step. Not just any iron, but something used shaped by human hands. Cold from fire, the curse lifted, or so the villagers claimed. So, the next time you cross a doorway, any doorway, pause a moment. Think of the iron beneath, silent and waiting. Not just metal, a memory of fear and of protection. The night grows quieter as you settle near a straw-stuffed mattress, the kind that crunches when you shift your weight. But something else lies beneath the head-carved sticks, barely finger-length etched with curling lines. Runes. The old woman in the corner watches your gaze land on them. For dreams she murmurs, and fevers. In Viking households, especially during illness or anxiety, small wooden sticks were inscribed with runes and placed beneath pillows or tied into bed frames. Each symbol carried meaning, some offered healing, others protection. A few, perhaps, were curses disguised as charms. They weren't decoration, they were tools. What's fascinating is how deeply literacy and magic were entangled in this culture. Not everyone could read runes, but those who could often practiced what today might be called rune magic or galder. These inscriptions weren't lengthy essays. They were single-word symbols or combinations like whispered spells carved in secret. You might find a rune for strength paired with one for sleep, or a name carefully hidden between two meaningless characters to avoid detection. Some sticks were burnt afterward, others were hidden beneath floorboards like lingering prayers. Runes weren't just read, they were activated. Historians agree that runes served many functions: communication, commemoration, identification. But their magical use, especially in domestic contexts like sickness and sleep, remains a mystery. Some scholars argue that the tradition was widespread, especially among women who acted as healers and midwives. Others claim it was restricted to a small, literate elite, priests, seers, or educated traders, making these bedtime runes more rare than they appear. There's a carved stick from the 11th century discovered in Bergen, Norway, that reads simply, "I carve runes of protection." It's unclear if it worked, but it was worn smooth by fingers. Someone believed it helped. Runes weren't limited to wooden sticks either. In a few cases, stones were etched and warmed in fire before being wrapped in cloth and placed near the ill. The warmth was soothing, but perhaps it was the symbols that brought comfort. One quirky detail that survives in Icelandic lore: sometimes the runes were carved backward, not by mistake, but as a way of reversing illness. Flip the logic, flip the sickness. Sleep then might come if the symbols faced away from the waking world. And there's a whisper of fear in some of these traditions. If you read the runes aloud incorrectly or place them under the wrong person's pillow, they might do harm. A healing charm could twist into a fever dream, which is why the old woman watches you now, not to stop you, but to make sure you don't read anything out loud. The wooden sticks beneath your head are smooth and cool. You don't know what they say, and perhaps that's for the best. You lie back. The mattress creaks. Somewhere in the walls, a mouse scurries, and under your pillow, the runes keep their silence. In the flickering firelight of a rural Viking kitchen, the smell of barley bread wafts through the air, earthy sour tinged with wood smoke. But as you reach for a warm loaf, you hear a crunch not of crust, but something harder. A sliver of bone baked right into the bread. No one gasps, no one complains. In fact, someone nods approvingly. This isn't a mistake, it's tradition. Across scattered Viking settlements, farmers occasionally added bone fragments to their harvest loaves. Not for flavor, not even for nutrition, but as a kind of edible charm. Bones of pigs, goats, or even old family cows, ritually cleaned and embedded in the dough, were thought to carry protective blessings for the harvest, the household, and the health of the living. You might assume it was ancestor worship honoring the dead through daily bread. Or perhaps the bones represented fertility, a link between sacrifice and bounty. But historians disagree. Some argue it was a form of sympathetic magic. Bones came from animals fed the fields, and so Bone in bread might ensure the cycle continued. Others suspect it was more symbolic, a way to honor what had been lost to feed what was growing. The practice leaves few traces. No complete recipes survive, and most of what we know comes from folklore collected centuries later. Some fragments of bone-laced loaves have been found in burial sites, suggesting the custom may have had a funerary angle as well, bread for the journey, bones for strength. One curious belief found in later Norse legends held that the crunch of the bone foretold good weather. If you bit into it without breaking a tooth, the harvest would come early. If the bone shattered with a snap, storms would follow. In some places, children were taught not to chew the bread too eagerly. Eat too fast, they were told, and you'll break a blessing. Whether that meant the charm would fail or your teeth would remains unclear. There's an old tale from the Faroe Islands about a woman who hid her husband's rib bone in the Yule loaf after his death, believing it would keep his spirit close until spring. She didn't tell her children. Her youngest son bit into the loaf and pulled out the smooth bone. He asked if they had baked a pig into the bread. She only smiled. Scholars continue to debate whether such stories reflect real practice or romanticized peasant lore. There's no scholarly consensus, though. Fragments found in the hearths and middens suggest some kernel of truth. And you bite carefully. The bread is dense, spongy at the center, crisp at the edges. Your teeth meet something harder than grain. You pause. Is it a sign, a charm, or just a shard of old livestock long forgotten? Someone pats your back, laughing gently. You found the luck, they say. Don't waste it. You chew slowly, unsure whether to feel blessed or simply cautious. Either way, the bread is warm, and in this house, that's reason enough to be grateful. The cradle rocks gently by the fire, its frame carved with twisting beasts and curling vines. A soft bundle rests inside, swaddle sighing, occasionally fussing, and beneath the blankets, almost hidden, is something unexpected, fine, silvery fur. Cat fur. Not for decoration, for protection. In Viking households, especially those devoted to the goddess Freya, cats were more than pets. They were sacred mystical beings linked to fertility, love, and quiet power. To place cat fur in a cradle was to invoke her favor to soothe colic and ward off restless spirits. Babies wrapped in Freya's softness were thought to sleep more soundly, cry less often, and avoid the attention of unseen things that moved in the night. It might sound fanciful, but across multiple Norse sagas and later folk records, cats appear again and again as creatures of gentle defense. Freya herself was said to ride a chariot drawn by two giant cats, creatures so strong and serene that nothing could frighten them. The belief lingered, cat fur carried calm. Some scholars believe the use of cat fur in cradles had practical roots. It's incredibly soft, warm, and insulating. A quiet newborn pressed against such fabric would feel cradled not just by touch, but by the smell of the family cat, a familiar, comforting presence. In a world without electric heat or sleep, consultants such comforts were invaluable. But practicality wasn't the whole story. This was a world where babies were vulnerable not just to illness, but to unseen forces. A baby who cried too much might attract the wrong kind of attention, trolls, spirits, the wandering dead. By placing sacred fur beneath the child, parents weren't just warming them, they were hiding them in plain sight. And yet, not everyone agrees on the origin. Some researchers argue the practice stems from pagan shamanism, not strictly Norse religion. Others think it was an early Christian folk carryover, where saints' relics were replaced with symbolic animals. There's even a theory that it began with midwives who used cat fur for comfort, and then ritualized the habit over time. One odd detail in a few recorded cases, the fur was sewn into small pouches and hung over the cradle rather than placed inside it. These pendants, sometimes combined with herbs or carved wooden charms, were believed to absorb bad dreams. The baby never touched the fur directly. It simply floated above, watching, protecting. A tale from eastern Sweden tells of a baby who stopped crying only when wrapped in the fur of a cat that had never caught a mouse. Too gentle to hunt, they said, just like her goddess. Whether it's truth or tale, it paints a picture of how deeply people believed in softness as strength. So, now as you peer into that cradle, you see not just a child, but a carefully built shield of warmth, belief, and feline grace. The baby yawns, the fur rustles, outside the wind howls. But in here, Freya is watching, and all is calm. There's something strange about the way the door hang sways. A simple strip of woven cloth, nothing more, until you notice the knots, tight, deliberate, evenly spaced. You glance at the headband hanging near the bedpost, same thing. Knots not decorative, but deliberate, tied before sleep, meant to catch something. In Viking homes, especially during winter months, people tied knots to ward off nightmares. Not charms, not runes, just knots. Twisted into cords wrapped around bedposts, threaded into hair or belts. These were quiet rituals done in twilight, often without words. You tied the knot, and with it you tied the demon. They weren't called demons exactly. The Norse word mar referred to a type of night spirit, one that rode sleeping people pressed on their chests, gave them bad dreams. Sound familiar? It should. That's where the word nightmare comes from. And long before psychologists or dream analysts, people tried to outwit these visitations with string. Some tied 9 knots. Others used an odd number, or a number passed down from grandmothers who never quite explained why. The knots weren't always visible. A child might go to sleep with a headband beneath their pillow, stitched with tiny kinks. A mother might loop string over the door and whisper a rhyme as she tied each loop. One odd quirk. The knots were sometimes undone in the morning, slowly one by one, to release the bad dreams caught during the night. If the string was untied too quickly, the logic went, you might let the nightmare escape unfinished, and it could return the next night. Scholars disagree on where this practice originated. Some trace it to Germanic folklore, others see echoes of pre-Viking Baltic rituals involving hair binding and sleep protection. A few believe the knotting practice predates even Norse culture, embedded deep in Indo-European traditions of thread magic. There's archaeological evidence 2 small knotted cords found in burial sites or knotted loops buried near thresholds and hearths. Their purpose remains uncertain, but when paired with the folk tales and oral accounts, a picture begins to form. The Viking world wasn't just blades and boats, it was thread and thought and a fear of what dreams might bring. And then there's the humor. One 13th century Icelandic tale pokes fun at a warrior who couldn't sleep without his knot belt, a looped sash he claimed kept nightmares at bay. His brothers teased him until one night he slept without it and woke up screaming. After that, no one laughed. You reach up to examine the cloth near the door. The knots are tight, smooth with age. Someone's fingers tied them carefully, perhaps, every night for years. You imagine them doing so in silence, not out of fear, but habit. The kind of habit that becomes belief, and then becomes protection. The wind rattles the walls, but inside the knots hold firm. Maybe they work, maybe they don't. But tonight, with one tied above the bed, you sleep easier. Because someone believed they would catch what chased you. As morning light filters through the slats of the barn, your gaze catches on something nailed above the doorway. Not just decoration, a horseshoe. Worn, rusted, still caked with a bit of dried earth. Above the kitchen, it faces down. Above the stable, it faces up. Same symbol, opposite meanings. And no one can seem to agree which way is right. The Vikings didn't invent the horseshoe charm, but they may have been among the earliest Europeans to play with its meanings. Some believed the iron warded off spirits like the threshold scraps we encountered earlier. Others claim the shoe attracted friendly vetter or household spirits eager to help with chores if properly invited. And that's the thing: above one door, the shoe kept danger out. Above another, it welcomed help in. Two gestures made with the same object pulling in opposite directions. Some regions developed strict guidelines. Facing upward meant you were catching luck, like water in a bowl. Facing downward meant pouring luck onto the household. Either way, the charm was working. Unless, of course, you were in the wrong region, then the same shoe might be seen as dangerous. This inconsistency drives modern historians quietly mad. Surviving sagas barely mention horseshoes. Archaeological digs find them in odd places: hearths, wells, even rooftops, but not with enough consistency to offer a definitive reading. The records are silent, and folk memory contradicts itself. A few scholars argue that the confusion was the point. Magic, after all, often worked best when no one fully understood the rules. If every household did things a bit differently, then spirits wouldn't know what to expect either. A kind of spiritual camouflage, one charming detail. In certain fishing communities, it was believed that a horseshoe above the barn door could keep the milk from souring. Not the cow barn, the hay barn. Why, no one knows. But if your milk turned, they'd ask, "Did you check the shoe?" Another tale from northern Denmark speaks of a widow who hung her husband's last horseshoe over the main door, upside down on purpose. "Let luck fall out," she said. "I've had my share." Her neighbors copied her, not out of grief, but superstition. Upside-down shoes began to appear across the village. 2 years later, someone flipped one, and the grain yield doubled. Coincidence? Possibly. But try telling that to the villagers. You run your fingers over the iron rim above the barn door. It's cold and pitted, worn smooth, where decades of people have touched it for luck, or to wipe their hands, or maybe just because their grandmother once did. That's the strange thing about folk magic. You don't always believe in it until the moment you do. The shoe stays where it is. You don't move it. You don't need to. Whatever it means, luck, protection, confusion, it has done its job this long. And besides, it's watching the door. That's enough. You feel something stiff tucked beneath a tunic, a tiny pouch no larger than a coin. It's not leather or cloth, but thin, almost papery, birch bark. The man who wears it doesn't seem to notice your curiosity. Or maybe he's pretending not to. After all, what's inside that bark isn't for your eyes or anyone's. Vikings didn't carry wallets or phone charms, but many kept small birch bark pouches close to the body, hidden in belts under shirts or sewn into seams. Inside these fragile cases were scraps of thread, carved slivers of wood-dried herbs, and tiny inscriptions, sometimes prayers, sometimes curses, always private. The bark itself was chosen for a reason: flexible, durable, naturally water-resistant, perfect for the damp climate of the north. But it also had symbolic weight. Birch was the tree of beginnings of spring, of the boundary between life and decay. Carving messages onto birch wasn't just practical, it was poetic. Very few of these pouches survive today. The material decays too easily. But a handful have been found, especially in northern Russia and the Baltic regions connected by Viking trade routes. Some contain runes too faint to read. Others hold folded charms wrapped in wool, sealed with wax, never opened even in excavation. What do they say? No one's certain. One debate still rages among researchers: were these pouches carried by everyone, or just a magical elite? Some point to grave goods buried with women and children, suggesting the practice was widespread. Others argue that only seers, midwives, or traders used such protective items, often linked to risky journeys or healing rites. In sagas, there are whispers of warriors carrying bark charms into battle inscribed with protection, runes, and personal blessings. But equally, there are stories of jealous neighbors slipping cursed bark tokens into a rival's bedding, subtle, silent sabotage. The same pouch that guarded your life could just as easily invite ruin. One peculiar account comes from a 14th century Icelandic manuscript. It describes a birch scroll no longer than a finger, sealed with sheep tallow and hidden in a man's boot. He walked for days with it, believing it would make him invisible to wolves. He survived, so the scroll was never unwrapped. Of course, the pouch might carry nothing at all. The act of wearing it, the weight, the smell, the quiet crackle of bark under your tunic was part of the charm. Like a whispered prayer, it didn't need to be understood. It only needed to be present. And they weren't always worn. Some pouches were buried in corners of a house or placed in the foundations. Builders sometimes pressed them into the clay beneath a hearthstone. So, the fire remembers us, they said. Others left them in trees gifts for the land spirits or bribes for a safe winter. You watch the man shift his weight. The pouch crinkles softly. He doesn't speak of it, and you don't ask. In Viking lands, silence was part of the spell. Two cradles side by side sway gently in the dim longhouse. The babies inside twins identical, but for a tuft of hair sleep peacefully. One mother watches with pride. Another nearby stares uneasily, clutching a bone charm. In Viking lore, the birth of twins was never just a medical fluke. It was an omen. The only question was, good or bad? Across the Norse world, twin births evoked fascination, awe, and sometimes fear. In some villages, twins were seen as a double blessing, two souls arriving in harmony, perhaps touched by the gods. In others, they were viewed with deep suspicion. Two infants meant something had gone wrong in the spirit world. Someone or something had interfered. This contradiction created a patchwork of beliefs. One Viking settlement might celebrate twin births with feasts. Another might separate the children, immediately claiming they must never sleep in the same room. In certain sagas, twins were even thought to share one soul split into two bodies. That idea alone could make a parent uneasy. And then the darker edge, the gift to the gods. In some rare accounts, usually whispered, rarely written, one twin was offered to divine forces. Not necessarily killed, but given over. Left in a sacred grove, or taken to a temple and raised in silence. A child not for the family, but for the unseen. There is no scholarly consensus on how often this happened. Archaeological evidence is scarce. A few graves with twin-sized remains have been unearthed, but whether they represent siblings or simply a coincidence remains unknown. Still, oral traditions cling to these stories. Grandmothers in Iceland as recently as the 1800s warned daughters about moon twins, children born too alike, too close, too soon. Some folklorists argue these beliefs were tied to agricultural cycles. A sudden doubling of mouths to feed could mean hardship. Labeling one child sacred might have been a way to cope with what followed. Others suspect deeper religious roots echoes of Indo-European mythologies, where twins often symbolize cosmic balance, or rupture. A curious detail appears in a 12th century Swedish folktale. Twin girls were kept in separate houses and forbidden to speak to each other until their 10th birthday. The reasoning. Two voices in one song call the dead. The girls eventually met, sang anyway, and nothing happened. But the story doesn't say what the villagers expected or feared. You peer closer at the swaying cradles. No one speaks aloud about which twin is favored, but you notice subtle things: who is rocked more gently, who is given the better blanket, who is passed to which relative. The village believes both are lucky, probably, hopefully. Still, the charms above the hearth burn a little brighter tonight. In a world where superstition met necessity, where gods walked unseen and omens whispered through smoke, twins weren't just babies. They were riddles, and everyone hoped they held the right answer. In a quiet corner of the longhouse beside the spinning wheel, A woman pulls dyed wool through her fingers. The thread slides smooth as silk, except when it's blue. That skein she sets aside. It's Friday, and she will not wear blue on a Friday. No one tells you why, not directly. But everyone seems to agree. Colors to Viking minds weren't just decoration. They had weight-meaning consequence, and some colors on certain days were avoided altogether. Blue in particular drew suspicion in some coastal regions. Worn on Fridays, it was said to invite misfortune, or worse twist fate itself. No one could explain exactly how. They just knew it wasn't done. This wasn't about fashion. In fact, Vikings were more colorful than you might expect. They loved bright garments, especially reds, yellows, greens, and deep blues, all signs of wealth and clever dyeing. But color had ritual meaning too. Certain shades were for mourning, others for marriage, some for sacrifice, and a few carried taboos. Wearing blue on a Friday wasn't universally shunned, but in some regions it became a kind of inherited rule handed down from grandmother to granddaughter without explanation. Some scholars believe this superstition had to do with Freya, the goddess associated with both love and death. Friday was her day. Blue was sometimes her color. Perhaps it was considered disrespectful to imitate her garb, or perhaps it called her attention too directly. Others think it might be older than Freya, linked instead to sky gods' storm rituals or early pagan rules around seasonal changes. But there's no scholarly agreement. The sources are too scattered. The logic, if it ever existed in a clear form, has long since frayed. There's an odd little tradition recorded in 17th century Denmark. A spinner who wore blue on a Friday risked her thread tangling for 7 days. And if she sang while spinning in blue, it would tangle for 7 years. That's not metaphor. That's a literal superstition. Imagine the frustration. You watch the spinner now. Her fingers move with practiced ease, separating strands, twisting wool into thread. She wears a russet shawl, a green skirt, and a deep red cap. All safe, all chosen. The blue wool sits quietly in the basket. It can wait till tomorrow. Quirky regional variants existed too. In some places, yellow was the unlucky color, especially on Wednesdays. In others, it was green on moonless nights. No one wrote these rules down. They lived in habit and hush. A slip in color choice might be dismissed with a nervous laugh or, more ominously, met with silence. Some modern textile historians suggest that certain dye sources were unstable, leading to fabric discoloration or weakness, and thus earned reputations as unlucky. Blue made from woad or imported indigo was costly and sometimes unpredictable. Maybe that fed the fear. Or maybe people just needed something to blame when the loom creaked and the thread snapped. So, the spinner waits. She hums a tune. Her basket overflows with hues, but not that one. Blue will return tomorrow, but today belongs to other colors. Out behind the longhouse near the storage shed, someone's left a ladder propped against the wall. It looks ordinary rough-hewn rungs damp from last night's rain. But the moment you reach for it, a hand stops you. Not today, the man says softly. Don't climb it, and don't leave it standing. To Viking laborers, a ladder wasn't just a tool, it was a threshold, a doorway between realms. And if left upright overnight, it might become something else entirely, a passageway for spirits either to enter or escape. In modern minds, this sounds dramatic. But in Norse cosmology, where the world tree Yggdrasil connects 9 realms vertical space, was symbolic. Up wasn't just higher. It was closer to the gods, the ancestors, the dead. And anything that bridged that space like a ladder could become a bridge for more than just feet. The superstition was simple, but deeply held ladders must be laid flat, after use never abandoned upright. Doing otherwise invited ill fortune, strange dreams, or unexplained accidents. One old saying from the Orkneys warned a standing ladder drinks in the night. Whether that meant spirits climbed it or cursed it remains unclear. Some scholars see this fear as an extension of threshold magic, the belief that certain places like doorways or windows act as liminal spaces. Ladders, especially those resting against rooftops, hovered between indoors and out earth and sky. It made sense they'd be treated with caution. Others argue the taboo had practical roots. An upright ladder could injure someone or damage a roof. Labeling it spirit bait was a way to teach safety through superstition. After all, it's easier to remember a rule when it comes with a ghost. One curious twist. In some coastal communities, ladders were left upright deliberately during certain festivals, especially those honoring the dead. The belief shifted: a ladder became a welcome. Let them climb, villagers said, lighting small lanterns near the base. These were brief windows nights when the boundary between worlds was thin and ancestors might visit. The next morning, the ladders were taken down at sunrise, often with a whispered prayer. A 10th century carving found in western Sweden shows a ladder draped in garlands and laid across two stones. Some interpret it as a funerary symbol meant to guide the soul upward. Others think it was part of a ritual display, an invitation, or a farewell. There's even a tale from a trading village along the Baltic. A merchant refused to lower his ladder one night before a voyage. The next day, his ship wrecked. Survivors claimed they heard footsteps on the deck the night before, though no one had been there. From that day on, no one in the village left ladders standing past dusk. So now as you pass the shed again, you glance at the ladder, still standing, still silent. You reach out, and then think better of it. Some doors are better left unopened, some steps better left unclimbed. After all, who might be coming down? Wind rustles the grove just beyond the village, a cluster of birches and rowans tangled in moss. The elders say it's sacred, though no temple stands within. Children dare each other to whisper into the leaves, and if one answers back, you don't speak of it. Not ever. Sacred groves were more than spiritual landmarks in Viking culture. They were living things. Places where gods might dwell or where spirits lingered. But they weren't just silent sites of worship. They listened, and in rare cases it was said they whispered back. These groves, known in Old Norse as Ve, dotted the Norse landscape. Some were marked with carved stones or animal skulls, others with nothing at all, just the unspoken understanding that certain trees were not to be touched, climbed, or spoken near after dark. The idea that trees had ears wasn't metaphor. People believed that if you spoke a wish to the right tree, especially a particularly old or twisted one, it might answer, not in words, but in rustling leaves, falling twigs, or dreams later that night. Some claimed to hear voices in the bark. Others were never heard from again. One particularly unsettling belief held that trees could trap your soul if you asked the wrong question. If it speaks a warning, when turn your back and walk away without looking. Whether this was fear or reverence is hard to tell. Probably both. Scholars are divided on how literally these beliefs were held. Some argue that the whispering tree tales were symbolic, a way of describing internal prayer or intuition. Others insist they stem from shamanic traditions, where certain trees were thought to host spirits or ancestors. There's also the possibility that groves served as early communal court spaces for oaths, decisions, or sacrifices, and the whispers were metaphor for collective judgment. Whatever the origin, one thing is, clear people treated these groves with profound caution. A 13th century Icelandic law code forbade cutting trees from certain sacred sites. Offenders risked not just fines, but exile. That's how serious the whispering trees were. In folklore, these groves often show up as places of strange bargains. One tale speaks of a young woman who confessed her heartbreak to a crooked rowan, and the next day her rival fell ill. Another warns of a boy who asked a tree to help him win a race. He won. and then vanished into the woods, never seen again. Even today, remnants of these beliefs survive. In parts of rural Scandinavia, people still tie ribbons to trees during weddings, asking for blessings. Others leave offerings a coin, a slice of bread, a lock of hair tucked in bark crevices. The tree doesn't speak, but they say it remembers. So, you approach the edge of the grove. The wind picks up. One tree older, twisted almost human in its stance, leans slightly toward you. A leaf drops. Maybe it's just the breeze, maybe. But just in case you don't say a word, you bow your head. And you walk on. A violet-hued flower nods gently atop a grassy mound. Its petals shimmer strangely in the morning light, almost glowing. A child reaches toward it only to have their hand swiftly pulled back by an elder's firm grip. Not that one, comes the whisper. Never pick that flower. Especially not here. In Viking-era Scandinavia, certain flowers were not just rare, they were untouchable. This particular bloom, often found growing on ancient burial mounds, was surrounded by layers of superstition. To pluck it was to invite sickness, madness, or even death. Children were taught from an early age to steer clear. Adults, too, kept their distance. The reasons no one agreed. Some said the flower marked the resting place of a seer, and disturbing it would rouse a soul better left dreaming. Others believed the plant itself was a vater, a land spirit taking floral form. Still others claimed the flower was hallucinogenic, used only by witches and wise women during rites they wouldn't speak of. Historians remain baffled. There's no clear botanical identification, though. Candidates include blue monk's hood, violet anemone, or even a now extinct local variant of foxglove. What's consistent in the accounts is the setting these flowers only grew where the dead lay. Or, perhaps more precisely, people believe they only grew there. One theory suggests that the flowers were seen as markers nature's flag on a sacred site. Picking them was taboo, not because of the plant itself, but because of what lay beneath. In an oral culture deeply tied to land memory, the flower became a sign, here lies someone important. Leave them in peace. Another interpretation dives deeper into folk pharmacology. Some of these plants may indeed have contained compounds capable of inducing visions, seizures, or disorientation. If a child consumed one even by accident, the results could be frightening or fatal. Thus, superstition arose as a kind of safety net. Don't pick the flower, and you won't suffer the curse. Yet stories persist that the flower had value, not just danger. A 14th century Icelandic tale tells of a boy who, ignoring all warnings, picked the violet bloom and tucked it behind his ear. That night he dreamed of a woman dressed in ash-gray robes who taught him songs no one else knew. He became a famed poet, or so the story claims. There are even whispered rituals involving the flower. A widow burying her third husband might circle the grave 3 times and then scatter petals from the forbidden plant, murmuring words no one dared repeat. Whether it was to seal the grave or open it remains unclear. Back in the village, the flower remains untouched. Children dare each other to approach, but no one does. Even the bravest ones glance back nervously toward the elder who gave the warning. You pass by the burial mound slowly. The wind stirs. The flower bends just slightly as if nodding. You keep your hands in your pockets, not because you're afraid, of course, just respectful. The sleeping mat looks ordinary, layers of wool over packed straw. But the direction it faces, that's deliberate. North. Always north. The old man who laid it out made sure of that. You asked if it mattered. He only nodded. You sleep the wrong way, he said, and the dead might visit. Among the Vikings, the way you slept especially, your orientation was no small matter. North-facing rest wasn't just tradition. It was protection. It kept dreams clear. It kept death at bay. And even after Christianization swept through the Norse world, the rule endured. North was safe, southeast or west, not so much. In a world where burial customs mattered deeply, this belief made a certain sense. Most Viking graves were aligned north-south with the dead, often facing northward. Some suggest this was symbolic. The realm of the dead, Helheim, was said to lie in the north. By sleeping with your head in that direction, you aligned yourself with peace rest and ancestral calm. But stray from that orientation, sleep with your head west, for example, and things could go wrong. Strange dreams, restlessness, visits from spirits. A common saying in some regions warned, "He who dreams west wakes with shadows." Whether those shadows were metaphor or something more literal, no one wanted to find out. Archaeological sites reinforce this. Grave layouts across Scandinavia often reflect a deep concern with direction. And some longhouses were even built with sleeping areas angled subtly north, not for convenience, but for comfort of the eternal kind. Some folklorists believe the superstition may have been tied to the movement of the sun and stars. Sleeping north to south aligned your body with certain constellations, especially those visible in winter. There's even speculation that it connected to animal behavior. Livestock often lie down, with heads pointed in consistent directions, possibly influencing human custom. But for most villagers, the belief was inherited, not explained. Children were taught to roll their mats northward. Travelers were warned to check the direction of their bedding. Stories circulated of those who ignored the rule, only to wake shrieking or not at all. One tale from the Faroe Islands describes a fisherman who, drunk and disoriented, fell asleep facing south after a feast. He dreamed of his dead brother, who beckoned him out to sea. The next morning, he sailed despite a storm. His boat was found days later empty. The villagers whispered that the dream had been real, that he'd followed. There are even rituals preserved in Icelandic tradition. When rearranging a room, you knock 3 times before moving a north-facing bed. To warn the watchers, they said. Who the watchers were is anyone's guess. Tonight, you lay down on the mat. The stars outside are hidden behind cloud, but the north wind brushes against the window, steady and cool. The mat creaks slightly as you shift, aligning yourself just so. Head north, feet south, just right. No one visits, no dreams stir. The room stays quiet. That's the point. And you sleep undisturbed. You pause before stepping through the doorway, just long enough to knock twice on the frame. Tap, tap. The wood responds with a hollow sound. You weren't announcing yourself. You weren't being polite. It's just what you do, what everyone does. And no one can quite say why. In Viking households, knocking twice on a doorframe wasn't about entry. It was about safety. The belief was simple, if not always explained. 2 knocks drove away the unseen. Spirits, bad luck, wandering souls. You weren't asking to come in. You were warning what might already be there to leave. The practice persisted long after the Viking Age, especially in coastal and rural regions. Even in places where Christianity had taken firm root, the double knock endured, sometimes rebranded as a holy gesture, other times left unexplained, a superstition passed along, like a recipe no one questioned. Why 2 knocks? That's where things get murky. Some say it mimicked the beat of a heart, reminding the spirits that life stood on this side of the door. Others believe it echoed early Norse magical rhythm, a pair of sounds, to complete a ward seal, a charm, or banish a presence. 3 knocks invited, 2 kept things out. And yet, no saga mentions it explicitly. No runestone declares the ritual. It survives in gesture alone, a whisper of belief hidden in motion. One scholar compared it to a folk fingerprint, a sign of continuity too subtle to write down. What's even stranger is how widespread it became. From Iceland to the Hebrides, even into the Baltic, traces of the double knock tradition appear in oral histories and obscure clerical notes. The widow knocked twice before entering the storeroom. Children knocked the shed door each morning before feeding goats. Never explained, always done. There's a curious echo of this in a 15th century folk tale. A traveler lost in the woods stumbles upon a strange house. He knocks once, nothing. Twice, and the door opens by itself. Inside, a fire crackles and a meal waits untouched. The traveler eats, sleeps, and leaves unharmed. The tale ends with one line. He knew enough to knock twice. No moral, just the gesture. Modern folklorists debate the origin. Some link it to burial customs, noting that 2 knocks were sometimes used to signal readiness to lower a body into a grave. Others suspect it was older still, an animist echo meant to wake the spirits guarding the doorway and ask their permission to pass. And there's the peculiar detail that the knocking was never loud. It had to be soft, subtle, a sign for those listening beyond the visible world. If it echoed too loudly, it might be mistaken for a challenge instead of a ward. So, now as you pass through the final doorway of this longhouse, you give it 2 soft knocks, not out of fear, not out of habit, but because something inside you believes on some quiet, inherited level that it matters. You cross the threshold, and nothing follows. The fire is low now, just a whispering glow beneath the ash. The longhouse sleeps, its beams creaking gently as the night settles in. Outside, the wind rustles the grass atop old burial mounds, brushes past, hanging charms, knots and quiet thresholds. You've walked through a world of whispers and warnings, where even silence had its reasons and the ordinary held hidden weight. Each superstition, each quiet ritual, bone and bread knots above beds, iron beneath doorways, was more than fear. It was memory made solid, a way to shape the unseen to protect the ones you love, with gestures no bigger than a whisper or a glance. You weren't just living in the Viking world, you were learning its quiet grammar of care. Let your thoughts drift now, as the village fades behind you. The sea is calm, the cats purr in their cradles, no ladders stand, no flowers call. Everything is as it should be. If you're still listening, maybe leave a sleepy emoji, and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time the wind is whispering in your part of the world.